Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure, as always, to welcome you to our evening program. Tonight's program, How the Soviet Jew is Made. Before we get started, please note that your video will be off as well as your audio. You may submit questions to us via the question panel located at the bottom right of your screen. We ask that you refrain from comments and keep questions short so that we can try to get to all of them this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's presenter, Sasha Senderovich. Sasha is Associate Professor of Slavic, Jewish, and International Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is the author of How the Soviet Jew is Made. He's also published on Soviet-born American Jewish writers like Gary Steinhardt, Anya Olnanich, Irina Rain, and David Bergelson. Together with Harriet Murav, he is the translator of the Yiddish writer David Bergelson's Judgment, a Novel, and from Yiddish and Russian of In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union, which is under contract with Stanford University Press. He has also published essays on literary, cultural, political topics in the Los Angeles Times Review of Books, the New York Times, The Forward, Lilith, Jewish Currents, and the New Republic. I'm delighted to also say that Sasha is a familiar face at the Yiddish Book Center. He is on the faculty of our Great Jewish Book Summer Program and also has participated in our translation programs. Welcome, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this introduction and for inviting me to talk about my book. Since my connection to the Yiddish Book Center has been mentioned, I also wanted to acknowledge my gratitude to the center. I've been on the faculty of Great Jewish Books for the last 10 years. That's a program for high school students. And it's been sort of a generation, maybe a couple of generations of younger people who by now some of them are, in their late 20s. With whom I've read some of the texts about which I ended up writing about. So I acknowledge them collectively in my book. And one of the key texts for my book is also a project that I worked on with Harriet Murav as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Translation Fellowship. So it's wonderful to be here for multiple reasons. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it is working. So I wanted to talk for about 40 minutes about my book so that we leave ample time for questions. And I'll do it in kind of 3 bits. I'll give you an idea of what the book is about and show you various images that come from different chapters of the book. Then I'll give you one example of how I think, research, and write about the topics that I consider in this book that comes from kind of the material that I researched. And then, and hopefully I don't talk too much in the first 2 parts to leave enough time for the third, because that's the part that's newer to me and things that I began learning after I published my book, which have to do with kind of my own family story, which I wasn't aware of until just sort of several months ago, but that in some ways I'm mapping over the things that I've written as a scholar. So to start, sort of the cover of the book, when one gets to write a book about the Soviet period, and my book deals with the 1920s and 1930s, the publisher inevitably first wants to suggest that the color scheme always include a lot of red to make sure that somehow the audience registers that this is a book about the Soviet period. So this is one sketch of a rejected cover in which the title of my book was meant to be in a kind of a red banner. Those of you who have read a lot of books about the Soviet period or know the field will be familiar with this particular color scheme from other titles about the 1920s and the 1930s, which inevitably always want to be kind of red and black. So luckily, I kind of talked my publisher off of that, and the only concession was this red coloring on the shirt of this boy in the forefront. And I'll talk about this image a little bit later in the presentation. But first, I wanted to talk about kind of what do I mean by the Soviet Jew, and what do I mean by the title of my book, How the Soviet Jew Was Made. As a starting point for my book, I think about the story by Isaac Babel, who is perhaps the most well-known writer, Jewish writers from the Soviet Union, very well translated by multiple translators over the course of the past century. And there's a story of his that is set during the Civil War, so around 1919. It's set in Odessa. And it's set at a cemetery near which, or really in the area of which there is an almshouse or poorhouse for elderly Jewish folk, and it was built by some, kind of rich Jews in Odessa for the elderly, and these elderly Jews are kicked out from the cemetery at the end of the story by the Bolsheviks, some of whom include also Jewish Bolsheviks. And the end of the story leaves us with this image that to me is really an evocative beginning to the story that I'm trying to tell in my book. The heat tormented the heap of rags that was dragging itself across the earth. And the heap of rags here is the way in which Babel refers to the elderly Jews kicked out from the poorhouse at the cemetery. Their road, or their journey, lay along a joyless, scorched and stony highway past wattle and daub shanties, past fields choked with stones, past bombed out houses, past the Plague Hill. Once upon a time in Odessa, this inexpressibly melancholy road had led from the town to the cemetery. And so I think about this image as a kind of a starting point, and I have questions. We think about a story that begins at a cemetery as a story of something that ends. Stories usually end in a cemetery. They don't start there. This is an interesting moment in which this image of the elderly Jews who were maybe meant to kind of, quietly die their peaceful deaths at a cemetery somehow get uprooted, and they're dispersed somewhere. And we don't know where they go, because this image at the end of the story leaves us with the sense that they're walking somewhere, and we don't know where they're headed and whether they'll arrive. And so I am kind of thinking about this as a beginning of my story, in which I came to understand the heap of rags, not as a pejorative term, but a shorthand for the collection of habits, practices, and cultural tropes associated with the defunct Russian Empire's Ashkenazi Jews that were appended by the revolution, but did not remain behind and die off in the old world. Instead, I think about, in this book, personal characteristics, worn-out possessions, disaggregated bits of culture, and uprooted customs that carried on across the landscape of the Soviet experience that commenced after the Bolshevik Revolution. And along the way, I think about how these bits of culture encountered and were modified by new ideological messages and structural pressures of the Soviet state. And so I think of the Soviet Jew as the layered and determined and fluid figure that emerged from this alchemy, which remained in perpetual motion. And I try to tell that story in the book. So to tell that story, I think about geography as really important. This is a map that I work with the map maker to create for this book. And it's a map that is a map of space, but also a map of time, because what it's trying to show is in the inset where you see kind of the magnified, the zoomed in, kind of shaded in darker gray, is the territory of the Pale of Settlement, Pale of Jewish Settlement, where Jews had to reside between the end of the 18th century and February of 1917, when the provisional government abolished the Pale. Jews couldn't really settle outside this area. There are some exceptions to this rule. And this is very well known as the place from which many of the ancestors of American Ashkenazi Jews come from. And this part of the the Pale is overlaid on the bigger map on the territory of the Soviet Union, which really began existing only after the Bolshevik Revolution, and this is in the map from 1922, when the state as such was created. So the Pale ceased to exist by the time the Soviet Union came to be, but I'm trying to think in the book about how the Pale remained as a kind of a conceptual trace, as a memory from which these disaggregated bits of culture, like those elderly people kind of moving into the Soviet experience, remained, even though they were sort of invisible. And it's really interesting to think about this inset because it also shows us that the Pale, the sort of more or less contiguous cultural territory in which Jews were living in the Russian Empire after the end of the First World War, and with the establishment of the Soviet Union, with the establishment of new independent states in East Central Europe, such as Poland and Lithuania, began to separate people who had been part of this one contiguous whole into new nation states. So that's also really interesting to think about, including some of the material that I work with that really thinks about that boundary in an important way. So to tell that story, I rely on a couple of sort of conceptual approaches. One of them is the time frame is really important. My book deals with the period between 1917, so between the revolution, and the very late 1930s. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is I think about, on the one end of that spectrum, 1917, the end of the Pale of Settlement and the creation of the Soviet Union. And on the other side of this, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which once again divides the same territory in a different way in the lead up to World War II. And of course, there's also the sort of traumatic, catastrophic markers of the same time period. The revolution and the civil war that followed is a period of upheaval, including violence for Jews and others, sort of on the earlier end of that period, and of course the beginning of the Holocaust on the other. So as it were, I think about this place in roughly 20 years as it changes, before it changes again. And the story that begins with the Holocaust is, of course, a different story, and deserves a separate book, and other people have written books on this topic, and there are many more books to write. But I focus only on the first 20 years for that reason. I also, in this book, think about between languages as much as possible. I work on the Soviet period, and I work in Russian, and I work in Yiddish. And this book is kind of half-half, both languages. But in many ways, I also think about how everything that I write about and everything that I think about is kind of always already Russian and Yiddish, or Russian/Yiddish, or Yiddish/Russian. So writers that I write about who wrote in Russian were also listening to Yiddish with one ear and really kind of working through some of the Yiddish idiom. And the writers who wrote in Yiddish were, of course, very conversant, both in Russian, but also in Russian language Soviet culture. And it's very interesting for me to think about how they created kind of the versions of what they were talking about in Yiddish that were sort of based on Russian and Soviet sources. So it's very important for me to think kind of across these two major languages. And here I think about Yiddish as the, ancestral language, traditional language of Ashkenazi Jews in the Pale of Settlement in this part of Eastern Europe. And I think of Russian in this case as a state language of the Soviet Union, right? So that's kind of the way that I understand these two languages. Of course, there were many other languages involved: Ukrainian, Belarusian, various other languages, depending on where Jews had lived within the former Pale. But to me, Russian is here kind of the language of the Soviet state. And therefore, when I think about how the Soviet Jew was made, Russian is really key. It's also important for me to think about translation in this book. so in the process of researching and writing it, I procrastinated a lot. And that procrastination was productive in some ways, because first I ended up editing and writing an introduction for one of the texts about which I have a chapter, and then together with my colleague Harriet Murav, co-translated another. So practice of translation of 2 out of 5 material and 2 out of 5 chapters in my book made me very aware about kind of intricacies of language and the desire to dwell very closely on reading closely what kind of language tells us and to build interpretations from that. So I really kind of appreciate having experienced this practice of translation. And so I also think about, so something that I don't do in this book and that others have done, some other scholars, I'm not really kind of concerned with questions about what some people call Russian Jewish literature or Jewish Russian literature. And I'm kind of not so interested in questions such as contributions of Jews, for example, to Russian literature. That's been kind of a familiar topic for some people who've written about people like poet Osip Mandelstam and some other figures. And instead, I really think about, and I try not to think about identity either. I'm not interested in the questions of identity in this book. I'm interested in them more broadly as a person who is interested in things. But in this book, I don't think that with the sources that I work with, which are literary sources, I can really get into the questions of identity in the same way. So instead, what I try to do is to try to look at literary texts and films, so creative texts, that are contextualized in very particular ways, in very particular circumstances, and that in various ways left a kind of cultural mark through contemporaneous discussions of them in the press or in reviews or by other writers, enough for me to kind of see them as significant kind of points with the help of which I can map out something which I call a figure of the Soviet Jew, right? So I don't really writing about real Soviet Jews, which is kind of a funny thing to say. I don't study enough material to be able to conclusively, kind of deal with people's biographies over the stories of their lives. Instead, I look at texts, literary texts, cinematic texts, to try to understand this kind of cultural figure of the Soviet Jew, where both the Jew and the Soviet have equal weight, right? And the Soviet and the Jew exists in a kind of productive tension between languages scattered across geographic and cultural landscape. So no, I'm not trying to disentangle the two. I'm not trying to sort of salvage the Jew from the Soviet or Soviet from the Jew. I'm really trying to think about how the two sit side by side in a kind of ambiguity and tension. So so this was kind of part one of my talk. Let me quickly give you a sense of what kinds of questions I ask as I try to map out this figure of the Soviet Jew. And I think of this as a process of sort of, painting a kind of a canvas that has details in one corner, details in the middle, details on the side, and you kind of can write these details, you can paint these details very well, but then what you connect together becomes sort of maybe somewhat elusive still, right? Something that isn't quite filled in. Because all that I feel that I can do with the sources that I work with is to really think about these contours. So to get to these contours, I think about a kind of a central text and a central question in every chapter. So I begin with a really kind of crucial moment, which is right after the revolution, or really it's part of the revolution, and that's the question of violence in Ukraine mainly, as part of what is called usually the Russian Civil War. This period is kind of marked by pogroms where estimates vary, but as many as 100,000 Jews had perished. And to think about this question, I think about a novel by David Bergelson, a major Yiddish writer, very well established by then, called in Yiddish Midas Hadin, and you see two covers of it in the middle and on the left. It was published simultaneously in 1929 in Vilna, which was in Poland, and in Kiev, which was in the Soviet Union. So those of you who know Yiddish can tell that there are different orthographic practices, and which Harriet Murav and I translated as Judgment, and it's available for those of you who are interested. And I'm interested here in this novel because to me, it sits at the center of several questions that are pertinent to the time. When I come to the sources that interest me, I'm usually intrigued by texts that existed in various forms. So this novel, before it came out as a book, was serialized starting in 1926 in all manner of publications. So it was parts of it were published in a periodical that Bergelson edited when he lived in Berlin in exile. Parts of it were published in newspapers, Yiddish newspapers in Poland. Some of them were published in newspapers, Yiddish newspapers in the Soviet Union. So you can get a sense that there's a sort of broad reading audience thinking about the story in which the main protagonist works for the kind of new Bolshevik secret police. The main protagonist is not Jewish. He's a border guard, and he guards the border between Poland and the new state of Poland, new country of Poland, and Ukraine, part of Ukraine that the Bolsheviks are trying to hold on to, and which had until very recently, before the sort of time in the novel, had experienced a period of violent pogroms directed against Jews from various forces that were fighting the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks, in kind of common narrative, in kind of public memory, had stopped those pogroms. In the novel, things become much more ambiguous and ambivalent because the Bolsheviks aren't quite sort of reliable as a power that might stay. And I'm really intrigued by David Bergelson writing this novel from later in the 1920s, many years after the end of the Civil War, many years after knowing how that story ended, but setting it at a time when the protagonists of his novel don't. So it's about shtetl Jews who are rife with anxiety about which way the wind is going to blow and which way they're going to turn. So to me, so the first kind of point on this conceptual canvas of the figure of the Soviet Jew is the experience of pogroms, but also the lingering trauma of pogroms. And that trauma persists through definitely the first 2 decades of the Soviet period, but also later. So a really great book about that is a book by Elisa Ben-Porad called Legacy of Blood that also deals with the legacy of pogroms. And a wonderful book about, really important book about the pogroms as such is a book by Jeffrey Weidlinger about this period. So that's sort of my first point. And sort of it gives me also an important approach of thinking about a Yiddish text, which is written by a Yiddish writer who is conversant with Russian language Soviet literature, who is writing this novel at the time. By the time, there are already many texts published about, for example, the Bolshevik secret police. So when he writes his protagonists in Yiddish, he draws from the existing Soviet prototypes. And he's also writing at a time when there is already an established literary tradition in new Soviet literature about the Civil War, including Isaac Barber's Red Cavalry, which deals with a lot of questions pertaining to Jews. But he is writing in Yiddish, right? But conversant with the Russian language literary sphere. That's what I mean when I say that in every chapter, I try to think about both languages at once. So that's kind of the first point, the pogroms. My second question in this book has to do with industrialization and modernization of the Stalin era, which is really a major period for anybody who studies the Soviet Union, Soviet culture, Soviet film, the period of rapid industrialization, of the way in which Stalin's 5-year plans, industrialization policy had sort of dragged this giant and quite backward country into something that might be called modernity or industrial modernity. And I think about this period with the help of a book by Moshe Kulbak, Yiddish writer Moshe Kulbak, called Zelmaniana, and I'll talk about that a little bit later because that would be my one example that I give you. But I'm really interested in how he thinks about a kind of a traditional Jewish family that lives in the part of the Pale of Settlement that becomes kind of very industrialized very quickly, and they live in a part of a kind of on the outskirts of Minsk in what now became Soviet Belarusia, or by then became Soviet Belarusia, and how their kind of traditional domicile out on the outskirts, all in the world of its own, looking very much like a kind of idealized Jewish shtetl, becomes part of this growing Soviet city, which now has electricity, has public transportation that can connect people between one place and another. And I'm really interested in how Kulbak is trying to think about Soviet discourses, about the creation of the new Soviet person, and he tries to kind of think about how a Soviet Jew can emerge as a kind of variant of that. So that's kind of my second really big question, industrialization and modernization. My third question, and this is sort of an odd thing potentially, but really important in terms of political discussions in its kind of public resonance at the time, is the question of Birobidzhan, or the something that later gets to be called the Jewish Autonomous Region. Many of you here might know what it is. There are several books about this, including a brand new book by Gennady Estreich about Birobidzhan. And Birobidzhan is a place that's in this red box in the Far East, Soviet Far East. It's in the territory that the Russian Empire had acquired in various military conflicts from what is now China in the 1850s. It is fascinating to actually watch contemporary maps of China. There have been several reports in the past year that China, sensing the weakness of the Russian Federation because of its disastrous and horrible and criminal war in Ukraine, China is kind of waiting to seize back maybe some of these territories. So this is really fascinating to me. The Pale of Settlement is in yellow, right? So you can see the distance, how far this is, just thousands and thousands of miles and kilometers. And a place where Jews have obviously never lived, but a place that the Soviet state had sort of presented as a kind of homeland for the Jews in the USSR. So I try to think about how this rhetoric of the Jewish Autonomous Region that the Soviet state proclaims to be the homeland for the Jews is supposed to be a place where the Soviet Jew emerges, but instead I look at texts by a couple of writers that you see on the screen here, who go to Birobidzhan on an expedition in 1929, and then for the next half a decade, even a little longer, continue writing texts about it, in which they're trying to find this Jew that is supposed to arrive at this new homeland for the Jews that the Soviet Union has proclaimed as the real thing, but are seemingly unable to actually find any kind of significant presence of Jews there to describe, because Jews never moved there in significant numbers. So to me, right, the third point is trying to think about the Soviet Jew as a figure who doesn't arrive, right? The Soviet Jew as a figure that's marked by a non-arrival in a place that is supposed to be the homeland of the Soviet Jew. And it's a really interesting question, even though very few Jews move there, right? So this is, you could say, an insignificant story from the point of view of demographics. It is very significant from the point of view of contemporary cultural rhetoric, right? This is very widely discussed in major press, and the texts that I'm writing about were themselves kind of attracted a lot of attention as part of that emergent discourse. So that's kind of my third attribute part of the canvas. Another point on this canvas for me is thinking about Jews from the Pale of Settlement, Jews from the Russian Empire who had left the Russian Empire before the revolution, before 1917, and went usually to America, but sometimes to Palestine, who, again, in small numbers, but in ways that were really culturally marked in a way that was prominent, returned to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. There were many reasons for this. The Great Depression in the West was one. they were interested in what the country was about, that they had left, in the previous generation. So I think about this figure of the Soviet Jew as a reverse immigrant, as somebody who had already moved out of the Russian Empire somewhere else a decade or 2 decades before, and now returns and is trying to kind of graft themselves onto this kind of idea of a new Soviet man and tries to figure out how to be a new Soviet Jew. I think about this with the help of a film from 1932, which is thought of as the first Yiddish talkie. Only 15 minutes of it survive in the Yiddish. The rest of the film that we have is dubbed into Russian, that played in the United States, among other places. There are reviews of it that I work with from theaters in New York that was playing as a kind of propaganda picture for, Jews in New York who had left Ukraine, Belarus, other parts of the former Pale, had settled in New York and were maybe now considering returning back. It's a fascinating story. It's a very kind of interesting film of this kind of Stalin era of filmmaking, and it's based on a script, on a screenplay by Peretz Markish, a major Soviet Yiddish writer, and later Peretz Markish also wrote a novel, actually, it was based on the film, and it's made by 2 directors, Rachel or Rachel rather Millman and Boris Spies. So very interesting, and the picture that I'm showing you from this film, you can see in the forefront this returning Jewish person from the United States, who, of course, it's a film about kind of industrial competition because it's a Soviet film. It's about production. It's about competition. Who can build a bigger wall at a limited amount of time? So he's laying bricks according to his American method here, and he is going to fail spectacularly. In the back of him, you see this kind of more upright figure of a Slavic, not Jewish Soviet person who is trained in new Soviet ways of bricklaying, who succeeds in this competition. And then on the poster behind them, you see this idealized Soviet man. The new Soviet man is the idea of what a Soviet person is supposed to be. And you also, if you look really closely, you see a person who is Black, also fascinating, and I write about this in the book as well. Nathan Becker, the protagonist of this film, who is Jewish, travels with his friend named Jim, who is a Black American. And it begins to tell that story that is also very interesting and that other people have told in much more detail about the interest of African Americans in the Soviet Union in this period. And then the final kind of question for me, or the final marker of the Soviet Jew, I try to think about Yiddish folklore, the tradition of Yiddish folklore, the history of Yiddish folklore, pre-revolutionary culture, as seeping into the revolutionary narrative and the descriptions of life in the Soviet Union in ways that tries to think about the new reality through by invoking these folkloric archetypes from the past. And to do this, I write about Isaac Babel, the most well-known person, Jewish writer from this time, the most well-written about. Everybody else that I write about, there really isn't very much scholarship of. In some cases, chapters that I read are the first pieces of scholarship on this text. Isaac Babel, by contrast, is very well-known. But to me, I discover something that I think others have overlooked or maybe weren't interested in. I try to think about a figure of a Yiddish trickster, Herschel Astropolier, in the way that he feeds into the story of the way that Isaac Babel brings him back to be a kind of a guide around sort of several key moments in these first 20 years of the Soviet period, including the Civil War, the campaign against religion, and also collectivization, including the starvation of Ukrainians in the early 1930s. So I said that I'll talk about this cover again, and I'll do it by way of kind of wrapping up what I think my book tries to deal with. The figure of the Soviet Jew, right, is what I try to think about. Not any specific Soviet Jews, I rely on literary texts, I rely on cinema, but I try to map out a kind of conceptual figure. And as you have noticed from the portraits of all of the people involved in creating this figure that I work with, all of them except for one co-director of the film are men, right? So I deal with male, primarily male, really exclusively male author texts, with the exception of this one woman who is a co-director. And I also kind of think about, in a way that's very forward and upfront, about this critically. What does it mean to think about a period when it's really the texts by men that dominated, and how the figure of the Soviet Jew became coded as male, as a kind of in a discussion with the figure of the new Soviet man, the ideological kind of concept of what a person was supposed to be like in the Soviet state. And I talk about this in relationship to also other bits of Jewish history that have nothing to do with the Soviet Union, going back to Jewish Enlightenment in Germany, in the Germanic lands, and elsewhere, where various discussions about the worthiness of Jews as citizens, potential citizens of different countries and later states, had to do with thinking about Jewish men primarily. So it had to do primarily with things like the army service and the kind of muscular type who could be a proper citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or whatnot. So there's a repetition of that in here, and I try to think about this critically as I think about this body of work. And that doesn't mean, of course, that they're not Jewish women in this period. In the book, in every chapter, I write about female characters in these female author texts as a way to think about some alternatives. And I end the book with trying to imagine what the story would look like if in the first 20 years of the Soviet period, there was fiction, which is what I write about, that was authored by women, and that was published in book form, and there somehow isn't in the same way. There are various publications and journals, there's poetry, there's later memoirs, the memoirs from the time, but I'm not really working on memoirs. So kind of to give you a sense of what I'm working on now, I'm translating again together with Harriet Murav, 7 writers from the post-war period, of whom 4 are women, 2 of whom wrote in Russian, 2 of whom wrote in Yiddish. And this is a post-Holocaust story in which there are many more women who write and who continue to write what I could sort of see in the future as being a kind of Soviet, How the Soviet Jew Was Made Part 2, where I try to think about a kind of greater diversity of voices when it comes to gender. And that story is very different than the story that I'm able to tell with the sources that I have in my book. So let me give you one very quick example from the book about how I come to the questions that I think about. So this is in my second chapter, and I work with the text by Moshe Kulba called the Zelmanianas. This cover that you see is published in the New Yiddish Library series at Yale University Press. I'm happy to announce, or sad and happy to announce, that this print run has run out, which is very exciting for a book that's a translation from Yiddish. And the happy news that it will be reissued by the Yiddish Book Center under the White Goat Press label. So look out for that sometime in the next, I'm not sure, months, maybe a year. And I'm delighted that more people can read this translation that was done by Hillel Halkin, in which I edited and for which I wrote an introduction. So one thing in particular I found very intriguing in this text. This text is about this family in Minsk. They're living on the outskirts of the city, and there are 4 generations living in the same space, kind of on top of each other. You can think about the story as Tevye the dairyman times 4, because there are 4 kind of sub-families and not just one. So one of the people in the older generation is Uncle Icha, who is a tailor. And at some point, he and the rest of this clan, which is very large, they go to see a movie. How do they get to the movie? they hear the ringing of the bell of the tram, which had just been built. So there is a new tram line that stops outside of the place where they live, and it takes them downtown to central Minsk, and they go see a movie. We don't see, the novel doesn't have a title of the film, but we have this description of what happens after this film. Uncle Ichi had to be content with reviewing in his mind all the ocean waters and white polar bears that had appeared before him that magical evening in the cinema. At night, stitching a pair of quilted pants, he thought with an aching heart about white bears and frozen travelers on icebergs, people for whom such pants would be just the thing. So when I read this, I'm like, what is going on? This is so interesting. And I had these questions because everything I write about in this book, all of the literature, was in a time discussed in publications that existed simultaneously, and itself was serialized in publications that describe daily reality. So I was really curious with this novel, but also with other texts, to study the history of the original publication, to see whether something like this description is not just made up by the writer, but is a reflection of something that had happened. So I started to retrace the steps of this text. And here I'm taking you on a kind of a small illustration of a journey that I take in every chapter of the book. This novel was serialized by Moshe Kulbak starting in December 1929, with a short break ending in 1935. So it took 6 years before for the whole book to be serialized, published chapter by chapter, in a monthly. And the monthly was called Stern, or The Star, that came out in Minsk, which is where Kulbak lived. So what you see here is the title page, or rather the table of contents, and the page that's facing the table of contents as you open the journal, for the December issue of 1929, where the second item is Moshe Kulbak's first chapter from this novel, future novel. And it's facing, of course, recognizable to all, a portrait of Joseph Stalin. Why is there a portrait of Joseph Stalin in the December issue of 1929? Because it's Stalin's 50th birthday. And there's a congratulations in bold, face Yiddish from the editorial board of Stern to Stalin. So this is, to me, really fascinating, because I can see how something that is a fictional text lives within the context of an emerging, in this case, solidifying, soon kind of to be totalitarian, but at this point kind of launching into this industrialization and industrial modernity with Stalin at the helm place, right? So I'm really interested in the way that happens. Moreover, it's interesting to think about the time. So at the time, so this is 1929 to 1935 or so, Minsk is the capital of Soviet Belarusia, or the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. At a time, this one unit in the Soviet Union has 4 official languages because of where it's located. And that's also a fascinating story. And here you're looking at the state emblem of the Soviet Belarusia between the two wars, so until 1939, and you see the Soviet slogan, "The proletariats of all the countries unite," written in Russian, the official language of the Soviet state, Belarusian, right, kind of one of the official languages of Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, Polish, because of where it's located and how it's been carved out of what had historically been Poland, and Yiddish, because there's such a huge population of Jews in Soviet Belarusia. So Soviet Belarusia at the time is a really important center, and Minsk in particular is a really important center of intellectual Soviet Jewish life in Yiddish. So Yiddish is an official language, one of 4 at the time. So this is where the novel is coming out. At the same time, Minsk is a kind of a small town. It's not yet a big city. So this is one of the many ads that I found in the newspapers that I was reading from the time to try to get a sense of what Minsk, where the protagonists of this novel lived, was. And here is an announcement for somebody looking for a cow that they lost. And it's on, the location is on Hirschleckert Street, which is a whole other story. Hirschleckert, a kind of Jewish anarchist hero who tried to assassinate the governor of Vilna before the revolution and was kind of martyred. But you get a sense that this is a small town with cows in people's backyards. And at the same time, it's a place which, because of this industrialization launched by Stalin, is getting its new tram. So when I read the papers from October of 1929, knowing that 1929 is when Kullbach began to write his novel, I began to see all of these articles about this new tram that the newspapers are really obsessed with because it's a really big thing in town. And so there's a new tram in Minsk. This is a picture from the newspaper on October 14th, 1929. We have the same day, October 14th, 1929, main newspaper in Russian in Minsk that announces the launch of the new tram. And this is a greetings from the guy who directs the new tram line. And one of the points that he emphasizes is that the cultural possibilities of the center of the city, cinema, theater, libraries, lecture, etc., will now be available to the residents of the outlying districts. And the protagonists of the fictional novel that I'm writing about, that Moshe Kullbach wrote at the time, are very much living in one of these outlying districts. So to me, this becomes even more interesting as I read this. And then, of course, since this mentions that people can get to the movies by train, I was really glad to find in the archives this photograph from slightly a couple of years later of one of the movie theaters in Minsk with the tram tracks in front of this, right? So kind of connecting the movies and transportation. So then my question was, what is it that they saw, and could we find in the press in Minsk at the time something which resembles a film that they did see? And at this point, I had a guess, but I wanted to have this guess confirmed. Some of you who are movie buffs might have a guess too at this point. So I started reading movie announcements, and then this blew my mind. So this is movie listings for the newspaper that's 3 days later, so the same week after the tram begins to run. And we have, first at the very top, there's an announcement for a theater play called Glukhoy, which is Der Täuber, by David Bergelson in the Yiddish theater. But then kind of in the middle of the page, we see the following: Nanook of the North, a film that's known as Nanook of the North, that was showing in Minsk that week in 1929. So those of you who don't know Nanook of the North, it's a film that's made in 1922 by an American ethnographer, anthropologist, who was a faculty at Harvard University. It was made in the Canadian Arctic. He was filming the Inuit. And the film is really known to scholars because it for a long time purported to be a documentary and thought of as the first documentary. But actually, what anthropologists and film scholars have concluded later, it's a film that really staged the practices of the Inuit, that the Inuit were no longer living because the forces of modernity have changed the way in which they hunted, in which they lived, etc. But that this white American anthropologist wanted to document as though they were still practicing them. So, for example, when he arrived there in 1922 with this giant camera, he had to shave off half of their igloo to fit in his equipment. Because if you think about the sizes of film cameras at the time, or kind of a very well-known case from this film, the protagonist of this film hunts seals with a harpoon, even though at the time he had already stopped doing that because they had guns. Also, that were acquired from this kind of Western kind of more quote-unquote modern culture. So people who wrote about this film, anthropologists, have come to think of this film as doing what's called salvage ethnography, trying to imagine a people and their practices that have already disappeared and try to depict them on screen as though they were still happening. So here something clicked for me as I was thinking about the protagonists of Moshe Kullbach's novel in 1929 imagined people, fictional people, based on real people, Jews, right, who'd never been to the cinema before, empathizing, right? If you remember the tailor who makes the pants for the protagonist of the film that he'd just seen, which, because he thinks that they're too cold without those pants, to me, this became a moment of a kind of recognition that Moshe Kulbak as a writer registered, right? That the people that he was writing about, Jews from the Pale, on the cusp of sort of entering Soviet modernity, experiencing that moment of ambivalence about being kind of between two worlds, right? One world still there, but already transforming into something potentially different, but the contours of which aren't known. And then kind of wrapping all this up, I realized that what was also going on is that the place where Kulbak's fictional protagonists were living was called a hoif in his novel, or a courtyard. Not the greatest translation into English, but it's what you see on the photograph. This is from Minsk in the late 1920s. A kind of a series of buildings around a common courtyard where members of the same family could live, or maybe neighbors, but there's some common space. Here's an artistic rendering of this idea. So they're kind of on top of one another, and that in the way in which that courtyard is staged in this novel is very reminiscent of the shtetl, of the East European Jewish shtetl, which at the time was a subject of kind of sociological ethnographic discussions in the academic circles in Soviet Belarusia, in Jewish academic circles. So Moshe Kulbak, who was a poet, and he was also a novelist in this case, had a day job as an editor or stylistic editor of the publications that were put out by the Jewish department of the Belarusian Academy of Sciences in Yiddish. And what were those publications? So I looked at those too, because I was really curious. They were studies, ethnographic studies of Jews in the countryside, or Jews in the shtetls and kind of the smaller cities, Jews on the outskirts of what became growing Soviet cities. And Soviet social science, Soviet Jewish social science, was kind of concerned with how to turn these shtetl Jews into Soviet Jews. And they were imagining in these kind of doctrinaire studies, ideological studies, what they needed to do for this. And Moshe Kulbak, the great writer that he is, ended up writing a parody of that discourse, those sets of discourses, in which he made us aware that what was going on was by no means a kind of predetermined, there was no predetermined outcome. He didn't know where things were going to go, but he was really curious about describing people in the moment of transformation, in the moment of what I call in the book, them becoming something that resembles the figure of the Soviet Jew. So I think I'll end here because I'm running out of time. I guess Lisa will come back on and we'll take questions.
Thank you. Sasha, that's fascinating. And I just have to inject in here that, yes, White Goat Press is going to bring back the Zelmanianers, which I know you've been encouraging us to do. But I now understand your enthusiasm. It's fascinating. It was an interesting, it was an interesting loop to get there. So let's jump in quickly. Do you know of Tolnoya?
Say again?
Tolnoya, Tolnoya.
Is that a place?
That's the question. So we'll move on from that one. Okay.
Not sure.
Okay.
There are always questions about a map, which I can't answer from the top of my mind.
That's okay. Didn't Bergelson also write a stage adaptation of Midas Hadin for Gossett during the socialist realism era? How did it differ from the novel, do you know?
Right. Let me stop sharing my screen. I probably should do that, right?
Sure.
I should do that, right?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Just making 1 second. So yes, I have an answer to this question. Thank you for this question. Yes. So Solomon Michoels, the most famous Soviet Yiddish actor, also theater director, who, by the way, plays the role of the shtetl father in the film that I write about in my one of the chapters in my book, staged an adaptation of Midas Hadin, which in Russian translation was called Mera Strogosti, a measure of strictness, right? There are many ways to translate this title. And we have not very much that survived from it. So there is we have the play text, the script. So we have that. That's archival. That's available in Gazette archives. Jeffrey Weidlinger wrote a little bit about this in his first book on Soviet Yiddish theater. And we have some illustrations that are archival. And I'm not in the right screen, but just earlier today, I was actually looking up the stage design that was done by Meir Axelrod, who was the husband of Rivka Rubina, who is one of the people whose faces I showed to you in the slide of people that I'm now translating. So this is all kind of a small interconnected world. So it's really fascinating. And I think there might be something like a second or two of rehearsal that's been recorded on film. So it's a really interesting play. I want to be able to know more about it, but I'm not sure that there is much more than other people have written about.
Someone's asking if you would repeat the title of the book written about the decades following the pogroms. I think they're asking about Alyssa Bonporat's book.
People are asking for books. Okay, yes.
Just the title
We
of
could
that.
also, as we follow up, we can do. So I named several books. Alyssa Bonporat, The Legacy of Blood is the book that I mentioned, but she also has an excellent book. Her first book is a book about the Jews of Minsk. That was very important for me when I was dealing with the Kulbak chapter. Jeffrey Weidlinger's book is called In the Midst of a Civilized Europe. And I believe that the Yiddish Book Center has a recorded lecture that he did based on that book. That's the book about the pogroms. And the new book about Birobidzhan that I mentioned is by Gennady Estreich. So,
is there any history on the Soviet Jews of Tashkent?
So what I find fascinating about so I've given a bunch of talks about this book in the past year since it came out. What I find fascinating is all the questions that people have about things I haven't yet written about, which makes me think about what people want to know next. So Tashkent is very interesting. I haven't written about Tashkent. I know someone who is also interesting story, is a graduate student at Harvard in the history department, who, as a teenager, was one of my students at Great Jewish Books at the Yiddish Book Center, a decade ago, who is now doing a doctoral research on Soviet Central Asia, including, she's not only working on Jews, but she's interested in Jews, among other things, right? So Tashkent in particular, right, the city in Uzbekistan, is kind of really known for becoming a refuge to Ashkenazi Jews from Ukraine, from Belarus, who were evacuated at the start of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, so Ashkenazi Jews, and it's a really large place, and they're kind of prominent figures from Tashkent who became writers, who wrote literature about this. So there's a writer named Dina Rubina, who writes in Russian and lives in Israel now, who has written quite extensively kind of a memoir, but also lots of her fiction set in Tashkent, and in this kind of Ashkenazi displaced Ashkenazi Jewish communities. And they're here and there, right? People have begun to study this, but there's not yet a book, as far as I know, about that. But I'm kind of looking to the student of mine. And that's not to be confused with also another important place in Uzbekistan called Bukhara, which is a place of Bukharan Jews who are really Mizrahi Jews who had been there for generations, right? For centuries, and are not Ashkenazi. That was sort of the old community that preceded the arrival of the Ashkenazim. So that's one. And I wanted to I saw before Lisa moved that there was a correction that Nosson Becker was not the first Yiddish talkie, it was the first Soviet Yiddish talkie. That is what I meant. I apologize. I have the correct nomenclature in the book. Just in the heat of the moment, I'm not talking from a written text. Sometimes I say a slightly wrong thing, but you're absolutely right. Not the first Yiddish talkie, the first Soviet Yiddish talkie.
We may take this as the last question, Sasha. There are tons of questions, as you can see, but I don't think we can get to them all this evening. We'll do a part 2. What are the 5 characteristics of a Soviet Jew pre-World War II?
What are the how many?
They're asking for 5 characteristics.
Well, this is what I did in my talk, right? So
yeah.
we'll summarize the talk,
They
right?
want
So
them, yeah, right. I think they want them to just be like,
yeah, the
pointed.
takeaway points.
Yeah.
So to again of the way that I, based on the archive of texts that I examine, right? So this is I'm not the person here who studied demographics or who studied sociology, right? I'm a literary scholar and a scholar of film who looks at literary texts that circulated widely at the time and they were widely discussed. So based on this archive of material, which is limited, right, and also limiting in various ways, to me, right, the points that keep coming up and keep being discussed is one, right, pogroms at the start of the post-revolutionary period, pogroms in Ukraine as part of the Russian Civil War, and the lingering trauma of those pogroms. That is very important. Two, discourses around industrialization at the start and during the Stalin period, in the way that the discourses of industrialization and Soviet modernity are interfacing with questions about Jewishness. Three, I'm very interested in Birobidzhan, right, the Jewish autonomous region, as a kind of ideological pronouncement by the Soviet state that the Jews in the Soviet Union have a specific home in a specific place, and that this is where the Soviet Jews are supposed to reside. And I'm interested in how, in the text that I look at of people who went there and then continued writing about it, they keep writing about the non-arrival in that place, right, as another definition, right? Four, I'm really interested in how people, Jews, who had left the Russian Empire before the Russian Revolution, before 1917, and there are, you know, in many cases, ancestors of many Ashkenazi Jews in North America, how some of them returned to their former homes or what had been their former homes, but now in a new country, in the Soviet Union. And I'm interested, again, there are not that many of these trips, but I'm interested in the cultural imprint that they left in the culture of the time, right, of the discussion through which these Soviet texts could articulate what is the difference between Jews in the West and something that I call the Soviet Jew. And then, right, my final point, I'm really interested in the lingering traces of what you might call kind of, you know, cultural Yiddishkeit, right? And for me, in this book, it's folklore. There are many other ways to approach that question, but for me, it's thinking about Jewish folklore, Yiddish folklore, Ashkenazi folklore, East European folklore, in the way that a major Russian language Jewish writer, Isaac Babel, plays with these kind of folkloric tropes as he thinks about the contemporary Soviet experience. So hopefully that was
You did 5.
I did 5. That's what they asked for. Right.
Well done. Well done. You passed.
and I'll just say before I put up my email at the beginning. If people want to write to me and ask me questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'm easy to find if you Google my name, but it's senderov@uw.edu.
And you can always write to programs@yiddishbookcenter.org and we will pass them along, your emails.
And if you're interested, you can get the book and read it.
Well, I was going to say,
for your library, get it
yeah,
for yourself.
And again, for everyone out there, it's How the Soviet Jew Was Made by Sasha Senderovich. Sasha, it's always a treat. I always envy our high school students who get to spend a week with you learning about all of this. So thanks again for taking the time to join us this evening.
Thank you.
Soon. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Be well. I'd like to also thank our producer, always there to help us through all of our programs and put it all together, Elizabeth Carteropoli. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's ongoing series of public programs, virtual, and now I'm happy to say we're going to be bringing back many live at the Yiddish Book Center programs this year. You can learn more about what's happening at yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Tonight's or next week's program, or actually September 21st, excuse me, I'm tired tonight. Join us for a presentation, Miriam Karpilov and the Yiddish newspaper with Jessica Cruzane. That's Thursday, September 21st at 7 p.m. and October 5th at 7 p.m. Join me for a conversation with David Mazauer, Chief Curator of the Yiddish Book Center's forthcoming major permanent exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture, which opens on Sunday, October 15th. We hope to see you there for the opening, back on our virtual programs and more. Again, yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Thanks for joining us, and a quick and really heartfelt thanks to all of our members and donors who make all of our ongoing work possible. So look forward to seeing you virtually or in person at the center when we reopen on October 15th for Yiddish, a Global Culture. Until then, good night.